I'm totally unprepared because I thought I'd just let Neil kick it off and do nothing, but it obviously is my responsibility firstly to welcome everybody in this room to the beginning of this year's Earth Itself event, which is a series of seminars, film programs, discussion posters, flash lectures and art and poetry readings around Water's Edge, which is the theme, and we've operationalised Water's Edge in every possible way that we can. Each year since the beginning, so we've done Earth, Air, Fire, and this is Water, and then last year will be a wrap-up here. Each year we've collaborated with John Carter Brown Library where the library has mounted an exhibition of its rare books and related material also on those themes. And so this year, as Katherine Ibbett might mention, there will be some discussion around what the exhibition involves. And I think that there are some things already which are the beginning of the exhibition. It's not the full exhibition, which will be there so that when you have drinks and nibbles, you can have a look at what is the greatest collection in the world of early Americas, early meaning 1820 and earlier, early America's material. And so it's always a great privilege to be in here and a great privilege to have various luminous slave traders smiling down upon us. And the reason why there's no hot food is, of course, that you've also got your feet on valuable carpets. And so I hope you appreciate this absolute privilege of being here. In the foyer is a monitor with some work of Wendy Woodson, and those of you for whom this is your fourth, you will know that Wendy has collaborated with us last year and the year before doing monologues and performance pieces. This year, what you will see there, which is also being shown for the full 2 weeks in the Ibbett foyer, 85 Waterford Street, is the beginning of a major work which you'll also be bringing to South Africa. With dancers at that point. And then, as you do know from the program, and as both I and Vanessa Janik and others will tweet into your Twitter accounts all of the time, there's a range of other extraordinary events going on, including some superb poetry readings. But what I'd like to do now is to welcome Neil Safier up. And for those of you who don't know him, Neil is a historian of Portuguese discovery and engagement with the Americas, and is wonderfully the director of this library. And so, I mean, Neil and I arrived at the same time, and it's been a joy working with him. And Neil will in turn introduce to you the panelists for today, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Lenore. Thank you all for coming out on this wet afternoon. It couldn't be any different, of course, for the fourth year on watery and aqueous themes. I don't normally get the chance to correct Lenore because she is normally so impeccable in everything she says. But I do, as director of the John Carter Brown Library, have to say that none of the people in the room that you see were slave traders. They were descendants of people whose empire of commerce and trade was, above and all, a maritime one. It was one that was built across oceans. You can see on the wall on that side the view from Providence Harbor. You can see on the other side Hong Kong Harbor. And indeed, their contacts were from one side of the globe to the other. They were very active in the 18th century. The family was, and that family was very deeply connected to the slave trade, as many mercantile families were during that period. What I will say on behalf of John Carter Brown, who is the bust that you see before you, is that when he decided to make the history of the Americas the focus of his collecting in the middle of the 19th century, he shied away from no topics. He brought everything related to the history of the Americas into his vision, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And in fact, we have recently discovered that in 1846 already, he was acquiring books related to the history of the slave trade. So I think it's an important legacy of this institution, which is that it was tied together with these questions of one of the most heinous acts of that would take place on the high seas, the slave trade, but that today, especially, our duty is to make sure that all materials are put at the disposition of scholars and publics for learning about that history as transparently as we can. One of the exciting things about participating in these 4 years of activities around the 4 elements has precisely been to bring this institution, which is focused around history and historical materials, into dialogue and conversation with themes related to the present day environmental challenges and or ecological crises, however you may see fit to view them. It also has been, of course, to collaborate across different disciplines and institutional structures here on Brown's campus and beyond. And for today, it is my great pleasure to both introduce and moderate this opening panel on fluidity, knowing waters in the Americas. As I am sure that most, if not all, of our panelists will also demonstrate, water was never limited to one hemisphere or the other. It is very much a universal phenomenon, like the other elements that we have looked at over these different years, and it connects as much as it separates. And so I think across 4 different presentations, we will hear of the different ways that water connects different individuals, different genres, species, and the like, and also the different ways that scholars are engaging with those elements and individual entities. So I'm going to introduce each of our panelists individually because each of them, I think, deserves a fulsome introduction, beginning with our first presenter, Bathsheba Demuth, who is Assistant Professor of History and Environment and Society at Brown. She specializes in the lands and seas of Russia and North America. And as a result, her current book project draws on years spent in Arctic communities, exploring the parallel fates of capitalist and communist development around the Bering Strait. From the archive to the dog sled, she's interested in how the histories of people, ideas, places, and non-human species intersect. Please join me in welcoming Bathsheba for In the Shelter of the Ice, Cetacean and Human Uses of the Frozen Sea.
First of all, thank you everyone for coming out. As Neil said, it's not the most auspicious day. And thank you for bearing with me because I'm still on Moscow time and I'm pretty sure I should be in bed right now. So I'm hoping that the jet lag holds off for another 15 minutes. What I want to talk to you about today is a tiny kind of micro sliver of my broader historical project, which, as Neil said, is a comparative history of the US and Russian sides of the Bering Strait over the last 200 years or so. And it's a region that geographers and historians call Beringia because kind of in deep ecological time, both sides of the Bering Strait were united by a land bridge, and today they retain a lot of cultural and ecological similarity on both sides. And much of that sort of ecological context and similarity is defined by the actions of sea ice in this space, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And what the sea ice does, and I'm shortening and condensing this enormously, as all of my colleagues who are climatologists and oceanographers in the audience will know, is that it helps sort of form one of the richest kind of biological communities, ecological systems in the world. And it does so because as ice forms in the fall, it excretes all the salt and creates bergs that are made out of fresh water. And then in the spring, as the sun comes back to the north, those icebergs melt and release fresh water into the ocean in ways that stir up all the nutrients that are on the sort of the deep water ocean currents and the ocean floor, so that phosphorus and nitrogen and iron and other elements that are necessary for photosynthetic organisms are released into the water column. And there they can be picked up by these minuscule phytoplankton, which are kind of the basis of the marine ecology in the Bering Strait. And trillions of these bloom every year as the sea ice starts retreating. And they are plentiful enough that they feed these huge schools of krill, which are essentially small shrimp. They're little crustaceans. And trillions of these animals in turn form these clouds that are so pink and dense that you can see them from the air. And they're large enough that they can feed, among other animals, bowhead whales, who are in some ways the star of what I'm going to be talking about today. And you can see why they're called bowheads from this picture. This is a whale with its mouth open, exposing the long sheets of baleen, which is how they strain the krill out of the ocean. And from that krill, from these tiny organisms that you can barely see, they make bodies that are over 100 tons, and are almost 50% fat by volume. So they're incredibly rich animals in a caloric sense. And they're so rich that once human beings figured out how to kill them, how to go out and hunt them on the sea ice, as I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes, they were able to support settled communities in the high Arctic, which is a pretty tricky thing to do in an environment that otherwise doesn't provide a lot of caloric mass for humans to get access to. But about 2,000 years ago, people along the kind of route of the black arrows that you see there going up across the edge of northwestern Alaska, and then following the white arrows you see going down across the northeastern edge of Russia, were able to harvest enough whales that they didn't have to pursue nomadic lives in order to feed themselves. And by the 19th century, the hunting cultures that lived along the Alaskan side of this route called themselves the Inupiat. And there were several settled, distinctive Inupiat nations and communities that made their living almost entirely off of bowhead whales. And the relationship between people and whales that had developed in these Inupiat communities was, not surprisingly, one that was incredibly intimate, partly because people understood in a very kind of corporeal and lived way that their survival from kind of all aspects of life was dependent on their capacity to have a relationship with these animals, and a relationship that involved hunting them and successfully killing them. Bowhead whale jaws, which are these massive arched structures, formed kind of the backbone of people's houses because this is a place where there are not a lot of trees. Bowhead fat is what people burned in small lamps inside these houses to keep themselves warm. And fundamentally, bowhead meat and blubber is what people ate to stay alive. So people's kind of bodily existence was very obviously and known to be dependent on these animals. And how hunters understood their relationship with bowhead whales was as one not of kind of hunters going out and proving themselves in sort of the classic way that's handed down through sort of Western ideas of sport hunting, but as a kind of co-constitutive relationship between hunters who understood and participated in the same moral and social universe as the whales that they were hunting. So the kind of separation between subject and object that we are inclined to impose between animals and people was not the way that people understood the whales that they were hunting. And this came along with a whole set of technologies, some of which were physical, like the boats from which people hunted whales, the harpoons that they used, the knowledge of how to not burn fires and how to wear light-colored clothing so that whales did not see or hear or smell people, to a set of technologies that were essentially spiritual and had to do with people's communication with another species through dreams, through a series of ceremonies, and generally speaking, through the understanding that whales had their own country, their own language, their own social world, and their own capacity to observe people at a distance and make moral judgments about people's behavior. So it was understood that in order for a hunt to be successful, the entire community had to uphold a set of standards in terms of how they related to each other, how they treated children, how they treated elderly people, how they distributed the meat from the previous year's hunts, how they had treated the whale, had they sort of gone through the proper ceremonies after the hunt and before the hunt, because animals were considered to be capable of making a series of moral judgments. And the space in which these sort of judgments worked out between people and whales was at the verge of the sea ice and the liquid sea itself. And this was the space in which people are able to use sort of solid water as a platform to bring them out to where the bowheads are migrating. The bowhead whales in the spring follow the sea ice north as it melts, because along that edge you get these rich blooms of krill. And it's on this edge that people are able to go out and actually access the world that whales live in. So hunters would go out in the spring, they would take their camps with them, but they were kind of very prescribed spaces in which there was not any cooking fires allowed, and people had to keep their voices low and always be keeping an eye on the water and keeping an ear out for the sound of whales' breath exhaling when they come up to surface along the edge. So a major part of the hunt was essentially sitting on the edge of the ice, using the ice as a space where you can get out into the whale country and listen to hear them speak back to people. And the experience for whales of this experience was one in which we can kind of hypothesize the sea ice came with a set of potential risks because people were inhabiting it and hunting it, and also because the sea ice was potentially a place that would pin them in if it was too thick and they can't get up to breathe. So the sea ice was a place that they wanted to navigate into because it came with access to rich feeding grounds, but it was also a place that potentially came with the encounters with human beings that could be either positive or negative depending on the outcome. And the way in which Inupiat hunters interpreted the outcome of a hunt was that the whales themselves chose whether or not to die in the encounter. And obviously we can't tell if that's how the whales think of this as happening, but the understanding both in the oral history record, in the record of anthropologists who started documenting this 150 years ago, and in contemporary Inupiat communities, is that whales will approach whaling boats and often approach them at just the distance where they can't be within harpooners' range, and they'll kind of just hang around and observe the boats for a little while, and then they'll either leave or they'll surface on the side of the boat where they're closest to the harpoon. And this is interpreted as the whales giving themselves to their hunters. And whether or not this is actually what the whales were doing, since we can't ask them, is hard to know. But it did mean that their interactions with humans on this kind of icy verge was one that was somewhat under whales' control, it seems, from the records of people. And it was also one that wasn't particularly harmful or impactful to the whale populations. Maybe 100 whales a year were killed by people out of a population of 30,000. But all of this changes very drastically after 1848. And what happens in 1848 is that the first commercial whale ships, coming from New Bedford, Massachusetts, some of them shipping out from Providence, make their way north of the Bering Strait. And they're there because there's an intense demand for whale oil, for people mostly to use it to light their homes. My guess is that this building was once lit by whale oil lamps, like many buildings in Providence. And by that time, finding whales that could be killed by sailing ships was getting harder and harder to do. So ships had made their way all the way around South America. They were north of Hawaii. And then in 1848, they crossed north of the Bering Strait. And the captain of the first ship who gets north of there, whose name is Thomas Royes, is absolutely thrilled when he discovers bowhead whales because they are so fat. And they're quite docile. So he spends a few weeks in the high Arctic killing whales, and then he sails back to Honolulu as the fall kind of comes in and it starts getting cold, and he publishes an article in the Maine Whalers newspaper explaining that he has found this kind of bonanza of incredibly rich whales and animals that seem to just swim up to whaling ships without a care in the world and offer themselves to be killed. And the next year, over 100 ships sail north of the Bering Strait looking for whales. And the whalers have every reason in the world to try to kill as many bowheads as possible, because a whaler at this time was not paid for days on the ship or hours worked, but was paid as a percentage of the catch when they returned to harbor. So they could be out at sea for 30 months, 2 years, And unless they came home with a hold filled with high-quality whale oil, they could be paid nothing at all. So the kind of tangible incentives for the whalers, while it was more abstract in some ways than the incentives for indigenous hunters to keep killing whales, was very pressing. And they were able to kill a lot. In the first couple years, ships are bringing in hundreds of whales a season, and they keep writing back and making these marks in their books. That the stamp that's at the top of the slide there is one of the stamps that they would put in their whaling logs every time they killed a whale. And then they would write in the little hollow space in the middle how many barrels of oil the whale had produced. So each year they're producing more and more oil, and they feel like their industry has basically been saved by the fact that they're able to find this massive stock of whales in the high Arctic. But then in 1852, something changes in how this whale hunt is going. Instead of sailing into the Arctic and finding large numbers of whales that are just sort of sitting there ready to be killed, the whalers start noticing that when their whale boats hit the water from their main ship and they start paddling toward the whales take off and they go hide in the ice. And it seems that in just a couple of years of experience of kind of seeing what the Yankee whale ships were doing, watching how they approached whales, seeing what the outcome of this approach was, the whales had figured out not just that these ships were dangerous, but also that they were not navigable along the edge of the sea ice. And the whales start kind of just spending more time closer up against the ice edge, according to the logbooks and the diary entries and all of the other information that the whalers are sending home. And in 1852, only 150 whales are killed in the Bering Straits at all. And by 1854, the Yankee fleet pulls out of the Bering Strait completely. They basically give up because they're unable to kill any whales. And there's a great deal of kind of mourning about this. And I think that this kind of tiny little example, which is sort of interesting as an anecdote, also offers kind of a set of lessons for historians in terms of how to approach this. And it's a set of questions and ways of approaching history that, while they're incomplete, because again, we can't go ask the bowhead whales what they were thinking. It would be lovely if we could. Some of them lived to be 2 centuries old, so some of them would have experienced this. They're floating around in the Arctic right now, but I just can't go interview them, which is really maximum professional frustration. But we can observe from their behavior and from the ways that the behavior has changed in response to human beings, and in the convergence of how indigenous populations think about whales as being sociable, communicative animals with a set of norms that they practice amongst themselves, with the new understanding on the part of marine biologists of whales as animals that have social lives and communicative capacity and sets of norms that are similar amongst themselves, that we need to take what the whales were doing as seriously as we would other kinds of historical evidence in the archive that might not express itself directly in words, but does express itself in a series of actions. One of the world's leading whale biologists, a man named Hal Whitehead, describes whales as having culture, and bowhead whales are amongst the group of cetaceans that he sees as having culture. And from this, we can imagine, although this is somewhat speculative, that what happened in the 1850s was that the meaning of ice and the meaning of how whales encountered this verge between the frozen world and the liquid world had changed. It moved from being a place where the meaning was one of occasional human risk and risk of being entrapped under the ice to being a place of shelter. And more generally, it seems from this small case that if we take the intellectual capacities of whales seriously, as whaling cultures in the Arctic have done for thousands of years, it's not such a leap to conclude that cetaceans live in their own underwater societies and communicate their needs and their wishes to the human beings that are willing to come listen to them on the sea ice edge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bathsheba. For our next panelist, we will be hearing from Katherine Ibbett, who is professor of French at the University of Oxford, and Caroline de Jaguer, tutorial fellow in French at Trinity College, Oxford. She is the author of Compassion's Edge, Fellow Feeling and Its Limits in Early Modern France, published in 2017, and The Style of the State in French Theater, 2009. She's currently working on a book entitled Liquid Empire, about the writing of water in France and the Americas, and she is one of 3 co-curators of an exhibition that will be inaugurated in a few weeks' time here at the JCB, entitled Bodies of Water, Bodies at Work. The story about why this is being inaugurated slightly later, I will get to at the very end of the panel. But I did want to mention that Katherine has selected some of the works that she will be talking about and showcasing as part of that exhibition, and those will be on display during the reception. So with that, I invite Katherine Ibbett for Staying Afloat, French Writing on the American River.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks, everybody at JCB. It's good to be here. So we're going to begin briefly in mid-17th century France, where suddenly many things are described as being like a river, the perfect state, the organized thought, the best kind of writing, Stoic virtue, the French language, and even, or perhaps especially, the king. So here is the king like a river next to a river. I started chasing rivers because of this simile, tracing it from its source to its flooding of the metaphor market. But I quickly got, thanks to the JCB, into very different territory. My interest in the way that figurative language ties into a new material management of water in France has also taken me across the Atlantic to dip into the waters of the St. Lawrence and the Mississippi, where French travelers insisted that the rivers they encountered in the Americas should be understood in relations to ones they knew at home. So the recent construction of the Canal de Brière linking the Seine to the Loire comes up in accounts of the Amazon, for example. They also found that their narratives floundered as they encountered these new American bodies of water, and my project stems from that narrative shock. If the rich eddies of sea studies, from Brodel's Mediterranean to Gilroy's Atlantic, have taught us to see large historical networks, scholars like the legal historian Lauren Benton have in recent years been trying to think through the different sorts of networks set up by rivers, what she calls a long, thin imagining of sovereignty. Alongside that, I'm especially interested to trace the various figures of the riverain, a term that literally means dweller of the riverbank, the rive, but has come to mean local resident in modern French. The sociologist Éric Fassin proposes that in France today, riverains, or local residents, form oppositional figures to migrants, making for a tension between residency and mobility he sees as being central to French racial politics. And my investigation of rivers looks in part to provide a geographically broad genealogy for that assertion. So I'm interested in the way rivers are used to organize all kinds of figures of political difference. So I'm interested as much in the residents of the riverbank in France or the Americas as the river itself. In the poet, the 16th century French poet Ronsard, for example, who sets the river as the terrain for a new national poetry, but also the Louisiana poet Julien Poidras, who writes about the nymphs of the Mississippi. The washerwomen were the most frequently drowned figures in 17th century Paris because they were pulled in by the heaviness of the sheets they wash. The canoeist, who'll come up today and who also features in the mini display over there, and so on. I should say that not all these residents are humans. I'm also interested in the animals of the riverbank. And when I speak about this in Britain, people tell me that I'm writing an academic version of The Wind in the Willows. And when I talk about it in the US, people tell me this is Huck Finn. And I think you can tell a great deal about the difference between these national traditions in that distinction. Throughout many of these very disparate sources, I'm especially drawn to a series of textual incidents about buoyancy, about being on the surface of the water, scenes to which many genres and media seem especially drawn. This is a tapestry featuring a famous scene from an early 17th century novel, and the clever and resourceful techniques that allow some figures to manage that encounter between the human and the surface of the water. This is Céladon about to be pushed in by his lover Astrée. He does not come out well. He's not very good at staying buoyant. Let me give you some of my American examples. The French were stuck on, sometimes literally, American surfaces, making shoes from skin that dried out and stuck to their feet and had to be constantly re-soaked in water, panicking over the frozen Great Lakes, which looked like marble, marveling at the snowshoes, which allowed for crossing snow without sinking, amazed at rapids where the river disappeared beneath foam, a foam so white all over that the water was not visible at all, says Champlain, and most especially, that's Champlain there. Most especially wondering at the concept of portage, the carrying of canoes past rapids or non-navigable passages to make a network bringing together both water and land, something seemingly conceptually hard to grasp for early modern Europeans. There are lots of wonderful coinages for the varied water formations of the Great Lakes. One writer calls them assemblages of water. For French writers, we could say that American rivers represented a narrative problem. One notes that the river carried him so fast he didn't have time to write anything down. Another suggests that the dense networks of rivers made it hard to write anything coherent, to find a beginning or an end. Still others cling firmly to the poetics of the list, seeing a river as a long line, an organizing principle that often facilitates a particular narrative of racial difference, this people giving way to that people. Another shape of river textual form is that generated by missionary dictionaries, those strange colonial prose poems, which often grouped thematic vocabularies of water, sometimes with little annotations added in extra knowledge as their compilers got beneath the surface of a new language. And in the display there, I have Chaumonot's French Huron dictionary, with its entries for canoe. So where European writers, humanist writers, often talk about going back to the source, ad fontes, all these American forms disrupt that question of source and easy progression. In the stories of these writers, the question of staying afloat is so insistent that it becomes quasi-allegorical. In Champlain's account of his 1611 journey, he recounts in parable-like fashion two indigenous men who fall from a canoe into the water, one who trusts to his swimming and strikes out for shore and drowns, the other Cania, mieux advisé, who holds firmly onto a canoe until he got in an eddy, Champlain says, where the current had carried him. And however tired and sore he was, he knew what to do. So he came softly to ground, tipped the water out of his canoe, and came back to us. The next day, Champlain goes over the same passage of the water to see the place where the man had been lost and to see if we could find the body, a kind of form of both tourism and care. And seeing nothing on the surface of the water, it is the surface of Champlain's skin that changes, as the hair, he says, stood up all over me. I'm interested in these compelling and compellingly repetitive passages to think about who is afforded the capacity to manage and navigate the elements, and to ask what texts can show to us around and beneath the surface. If you're a literary scholar, you'll know that people have been arguing for the past few years about what it means to do surface reading. I won't bore you with the details of that argument, but I'm kind of taking that really literally in this project. In the reading on the Mississippi that I carried out at JCB last year, the question of the canoe comes to the fore, and if I were an 18th century writer, I would pause here and explain to you what a canoe is and how you can build one at home. You can see images about that kind of thing in the display case. The descriptions of canoes become a good way for us to track what people took with them on these expeditions. People detail how much you can put in one at different times of the year, when the waters run high or low, without getting stuck on the rocks. Endless recursivity in these descriptions. In some cases, most notably Hennepin's Nouvelle Découverte, which is in the case, each time a canoe is mentioned, it is re-explained, and the travelers find the canoe itself to be an endlessly recursive form, a constant exchange of the wet and the dry as they bail themselves out, dry out, get wet again, and on they go. For some writers, the canoe represents a sort of floating European jurisdiction. Hennepin describes his canoe as a portable chapel and an ambulant fort, and the French term gouverner, to both govern and navigate, comes into good service here. But most, like Joutel in 1713, insist on the failure of their own knowledge in dealing with local materials and with the new kind of navigation needed. In counterpoint, an acknowledgement of the skill in both making and navigating canoes becomes the only point on which the French will concede ingenuity and industry, both key proto-Enlightenment terms, to indigenous people. So Henri de Tonty, for example, the great mercenary traveler with La Salle, is constantly saying that the people he encounters are good at nothing but canoes. But when he describes their canoes, there's a sudden sort of sprouting of superlatives to show how good they are at it. Sometimes the acknowledged competence in these matters becomes grounds for a more generous consideration of indigenous behavior more broadly. In Gaspésie, the Franciscan Christian Leclerc recounts in 1691, he set out in a canoe to the planned site of a mission church, clutching the church's ornaments on his knees. If you've read Peter Carey's Oscar and Lucinda, and you should, you'll know why this scene appeals to me. But the wind blows up as he's clutching his altarpieces, and the boat breaks, and it is only what he calls the charitable aid of the savages camped along the river, which saves him, and he moves very swiftly from a praise of their navigational techniques to a praise of their emotional capacity. It's hard to know, I have to say, how to take all Leclerc's canoe stories. He also describes a river in Gaspésie that is so full of beavers that there's no room left for canoes. The river has just become all beaver, so they have to hop out and carry the boats. And there's an image of a similarly beaver-packed river in the display case there. The Jesuit Lafitaux's, this is his image, also in the display case, 1724 account of the customs of the Americans, extols the ease of maneuver of bark canoes and calls them the artistic masterpiece of the savages. Nothing, he says, is prettier or more admirable than these fragile machines. And machines is also an 18th century term, I might note, for hammocks. I learnt that last year from JCB fellow Marcy Norton. Lafitau also insists on the indigenous capacity to read the water's surface, using it to predict, he says, the canoe coming round the bend or the fish coming up from the depths, because of their ability to read what Lafitau sees as mere lines on the water's surface, a capacity he describes as akin to ancient mystical practices of reading signs and vestiges. Many river texts insist on the fragility of their very medium. La Condamine's account of the Amazon tells of how his papers fall in and how, in a process he describes as necessary but boring, he had to dry them out page by page before he could continue. These scenes of what I call wet reading, of deciphering something that's too fragile to read because it's wet, that happen enormously often in novels of this period. So novels are often wrecked because the love letter that a hero floats down the river doesn't quite make it dry to its destined reader. And these scenes of wet reading in the American context foster the notion that not only the explorer-writer, but even the text itself is somehow heroic. It has survived to bear witness and made it all the way back to France. Sometimes, on days that are worse than La Condamine's boring but necessary dry-out days, the stuff falls in and you just can't get it out. After a long journey to map the Mississippi, this is Joliet's wonderful map, ici présente in the JCB, Louis Joliet, who has had, he says, a very lucky and happy journey exploring the Mississippi, as he's coming back into Montreal, is 15 minutes away from home, can already see French settlements along the river. He drops all his carefully prepared papers in the St. Lawrence. And so this extraordinary map, which I pored over this morning, was in fact done from memory. Sometimes then, the failure to stay afloat makes room for a different kind of resourcefulness. And on that note, I will stop bobbing around at the surface of my project and sink to my seat. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. I have clearly not used enough watery metaphors in my text. I stand aware of that fault. The next speaker on our panel is Noor Johnson, the second of our panelists who has a bachelor's degree from Brown University. The first one spoke first on the panel. Just thought I would mention that. Noor is a research scientist with a joint appointment at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and the National Snow and Ice Data Center at the University of Colorado at Boulder. She was trained as a cultural anthropologist, and her work focuses on politics and practices of environmental knowledge production and decision-making in the Arctic. Her most recent project looks at the legal, political, and scientific dimensions of an offshore seismic testing project in Baffin Bay. And for that project, she has worked with community-based monitoring practitioners from around the Arctic on issues relating to network building and scaling of environmental observation. She holds a PhD from McGill University, an MA from American University, and the aforementioned BA from Brown University. Please join me in welcoming Noor for a talk on Our Water, Our Food.
Great. Well, thank you for that welcome. It's wonderful to be back at Brown. I also did a postdoc at Brown, so it's very, very nice to be back. I am glad to see my advisor, Amanda Lynch, in the audience, and that was where I met Lenora. So it's just lovely to have been invited to come back. And I also have to say, I think I am the sort of contemporary on today's panel. So I have a hashtag in my title. And this is, in fact, the first time I have been inside the John Carter Brown Library. So very exciting for me to be here. So I think that I'm very pleased to have followed Bathsheba's wonderful presentation because she introduced the ethic of care in Inuit hunting tradition, which is really the same ethic of care that I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to talk about how the politics around a particular resisting a seismic testing campaign reflect that ethic of care for animals. And the region that I'm going to be talking about is the Eastern Canadian Arctic. But I'll begin with just probably what is a familiar image for many of you, and this is the way that many of us enter into the Arctic this is the gaze from a distance that's showing how the sea ice is changing. And this transformation of ice into water is really what has started to invite increasing amounts of interest on the part of outsiders who become excited about the possibilities that the fluid state of the ocean may enable in terms of facilitating new extractive industry and different forms of commerce. So I think many of you have probably heard about the potential and increasingly now used sea routes. One of the most famous is the Northwest Passage, which promises to shorten the length of shipping between Asia and Europe by 10 days over the conventional route through the Panama Canal. And you probably also are aware that the Arctic offshore holds about 30% of the undiscovered natural gas resources and 13% of undiscovered oil resources. So there is increasing interest in the region by people from outside the Arctic. And the sort of melting of the ice and the transformations that are happening in the Arctic really look very different to Arctic residents. So I'm going to take you today to a place called Kangik-Tungapik, or Clyde River. Kangik-Tungapik is a very small community. It's located in the Eastern Canadian Arctic on Baffin Island. So you can see here, this is Clyde River. And this map I also want to point out because it becomes relevant a little bit later in my talk. This is a map that shows the land claim regions of northern Canada. Land claims are modern treaties that First Nations and Inuit have entered into with the Government of Canada. And Nunavut territory is the territory where Clyde River is located. This is one of the most recent land claims. Nunavut is roughly a little bit smaller than the size of Mexico. It's a very vast territory, and it has about 35,000 residents. So very few people scattered across a vast expanse of land. And you'll see that the boundary of the territory, which you can sort of make out as a little, I believe it's a little pink line, is at the edge of the shore-fast ice. And that's the location of the land claim territory, because that was where they could demonstrate continuous use by Inuit. So Inuit, I'm going to show you some images of this from Clyde River. Inuit have always been marine mammal hunters. And in this part of the Arctic, rather than hunting the bowhead whale, which does not travel in these waters, Inuit hunt smaller marine mammals, but still quite large. They hunt seal as their primary animal that they hunt and eat still. They also hunt narwhal, and they hunt walrus, and they harvest many other smaller animals. So here you can see some of the residents from Clyde River practicing subsistence, harvesting berries along the water's edge, doing a jigging, which is a sort of a fun game that they do in the wintertime, catching little fish. And then skinning seal, which, as I already mentioned, is one of the primary sources of their subsistence foods in the area. And these are some images of hunting on and through the sea ice. So this is the traditional method of hunting seal through a breathing hole in the ice. And then, they would traditionally actually butcher the seal in place where it was harvested right on the ice. And so the ice is really, as it is for the Inupiat in this region, it's a real extension of the social space for Inuit. And Inuit harvesting and travel really changes with the seasons. So in the summertime, they use boats and they still navigate the waters, but in different ways. And in the winter, they do a lot of travel and they spend a lot of time on the sea ice. So you can imagine that because the sea ice and the marine mammals are such an important part of the cultural and subsistence practices of this region, that when in 2014 the government of Canada authorized a seismic testing project, Inuit had a lot of concerns. And for those of you unfamiliar with seismic testing is done in the marine context in order to map the resources in the seafloor bed. So it's done by a ship, and the ship drags a long line that has air guns attached to it. And the air guns issue loud blasts in the water, which go off roughly every 12 seconds, 24 hours a day. And the ship is present in the waters for the entire period where they're open. So the entire ice-free season, the ship would be there. And this would have taken place over a period of 5 years. And so you can see here this is a map. The map on your on your left is a map of the seismic testing region that was approved. And again, to revisit this map of the Nunavut land claim, it's just beyond the edge of the land claim. So this is, therefore, the legal framework was not triggered. So Inuit were not able to say no directly to this project. They had to use other means of resistance to try to stop this seismic testing from happening. And there isn't time to go into the details of the known impacts of seismic testing on marine life, but just suffice it to say that there are very well documented impacts, particularly on marine mammals in terms of their hearing, and then their strategies of avoidance of those areas when seismic testing is taking place. And this is just to show, this is a land and sea ice use map that was generated that shows that actually Inuit do use parts of the waters that extend beyond the land claim area. So the land claim is also something that's being still considered and discussed and could potentially be reopened based on Inuit use that's over a more extensive area. So for my project, I visited some of the communities that were affected, and I talked to them about their concerns about seismic testing and also about the process of decision-making that took place that led up to issuing the permit on seismic testing. And they communicated a number of concerns, which I will not discuss in detail. But one of the areas of concern, I do want to mention two of them. One of them was around the availability and communication of information. And this really goes back to the issue of knowledge and whose knowledge is authorized as legitimate in decision making. Ironically, there was plenty of scientific knowledge that could have been mobilized in this process to show evidence that seismic testing would be harmful. But it was not mobilized very robustly. It was sort of referenced. It was not provided to the community when they requested it in a timely manner. And also, very importantly, Inuit knowledge was not engaged or included. So Inuit had their own knowledge about the impacts of seismic testing because they had seen seismic testing happening in the past. In the 1970s, there was a seismic testing campaign that had a very large impact on marine mammals that they had themselves observed. So there was a very circumscribed process for engaging both scientific and Inuit knowledge in the decision-making process. And another area of concern that I think is really relevant to the issue of the relationship that Inuit have with mammals and how they observe and can attest to animal behavior that's not necessarily visible to scientists relates to what scientists would call cumulative impacts. So in the community of Pond Inlet, the narwhal is one of the marine mammals that they harvest and that is really important to their cultural practice and their nutritional, as an important source of nutrition as well. And they had observed that narwhal were beginning to avoid the area. But they said, we can't tell why this is the case. Obviously, the seismic testing hadn't begun yet in Canada, but there was seismic testing happening just across Baffin Bay in Greenland. At the same time, an iron ore mine had recently opened up, and so ships were passing through the region. With the melting ice, they were also observing killer whale entering into the region for the first time in a long time. And killer whale are a predator of narwhal. So there were all of these different impacts, and Inuit were seeing that we need to trace all of them together. And the process of creating sort of boundaries around decision-making and boundaries around when certain kinds of knowledge is admitted into the decision-making process was a real flaw in the process from the Inuit perspective. And these are just some quotes that are sort of attesting to, these are examples of the kinds of knowledge that Inuit shared about the risks that they perceived through seismic testing. So mobilizing all of these concerns, Inuit used 3 different strategies to resist this seismic testing campaign. And the first strategy that they used was activism. And this was an interesting strategy to me because if you hang around Inuit in Canada, you often hear them say, Inuit are not activists. And what they mean by that is that Inuit have tended to use sort of more sanctioned political processes to bring their perspectives forward. But in this case, they really needed to say no very clearly and very publicly because the process of consultation had failed them. It had failed to really respond to their concerns. And so this is a story for another time, and I'm writing this story elsewhere, but one of the strategies that they used was to collaborate and partner with Greenpeace. And for those of you who have followed Inuit politics, this was a really radical thing that they did because traditionally Greenpeace has been very much not welcome in Inuit communities since the 1970s and 80s when they led a campaign to ban seal skin products. So a story for another time, but a really interesting partnership. So they worked together to get the word out through social media campaigns that really traveled across Canada and across the world. Emma Thompson came and visited Clyde River. There was quite a bit of media that emerged from this campaign. And they did a wonderful job, I think, of keeping the focus on the stories from Inuit at the community level. So you can see 2 examples here of people that are sharing their pictures and making statements about why the water and the animals in Baffin Bay are really essential for Inuit cultural and subsistence traditions. The second strategy that they used was looking again at the issue of knowledge and the sense that they had not been ready, they had not been prepared to engage through the formal consultation process in a way that would really have ensured that Inuit knowledge and strong science were part of the decision-making process. And so communities, these two images are from the two communities that I visited. One is Pond Inlet, and so the picture of people on the ice is a picture of a community-based monitoring program that is emerging from concerns about the seismic testing. So they're going to be doing monitoring of marine mammals, of different kinds of mammals, and looking at them in the context of different kinds of development and different changes in the offshore. And the other is an atlas that the community of Clyde River has put together, and the goal of this atlas is to actually repatriate a lot of the research and the studies that have been done, because one of the real strong concerns that many communities have is that researchers come and they do studies and they leave and they don't bring the knowledge back. So they have actually gone out and located a number of studies that have been important, that governments have done, that researchers have done, and they've brought them back and they're putting them into a community-owned database, and then they're visualizing that information in ways that it will be ready to be used the next time they need to have it ready. So the next time there's something that they need to resist or say no to or say yes to or make any kind of decision, they'll be more prepared. And then the final strategy was a legal strategy, and that emerged through their partnership with Greenpeace. And this was a really actually good news story. So they brought a case against the government of Canada, first to the Court of Appeal, and then it was elevated to the Supreme Court of Canada. And the Supreme Court ruled in their favor last year, which was a really amazing and kind of exciting moment for those following the case, and it became a sort of an emblem across Canada for many First Nations groups who are working on resisting pipelines, resisting different kinds of energy and extractive projects on their lands and territories, because the ruling was really about the practice of consultation. And the ruling emphasized the need for what the judges called deep consultation. So it had to really go much beyond the kind of pro forma consultation that's often used, where communities feel like someone showed up and held a meeting, but they wanted the community said no, and then there was no sense that was actually taken into consideration when the final decision was made. So I think just sort of coming back to the theme of the water's edge and the idea of fluidity, I wanted to sort of bring in the Inuit myth of Sedna, which I think many of you are probably familiar with Sedna. She is the Inuit goddess of the sea, and she controls the sea creatures, the whales and the seals and the fish. And in traditional Inuit cosmology, the Sedna was moody, and she sometimes would withhold animals. And when animals were not abundant, Inuit would send a shaman to go and comb her hair and placate her, make her feel better, and then she would release the animals. And so this is a certain kind of attentive care to, attentiveness to the fact that the sea is a harsh environment. The animals are unpredictable. Animals have their own agency that is beyond the control of humans, and yet it requires some kind of care and a certain kind of practice in order to make sure that the animals are replenished and renewed. And so I think the examples that I shared, I would argue, are sort of modern day examples of how Inuit are practicing what people often refer to as adaptation, but I actually would prefer the word fluidity, that they're able to invent and use new strategies to be able to continue to practice these relations of care. And so in this case, we looked at activism, legal strategies, and documentation of knowledge and being able to mobilize knowledge in new ways. And these are all, I think, reflective of their long-term commitment to an ethic of care for animals and an ethic of stewardship that we also heard about in Bathsheba's remarks. So I'll just end with a quote from a young woman from Pond Inlet who, when I was interviewing her about the seismic testing campaign, and she was telling me about all of these new projects that younger people in Pond Inlet were taking on in order to really be able to document what changes were happening. And she said Inuit have stepped up and they really want to take ownership of research. And she found this to be very hopeful. She said, I look forward to what the future holds. More and more will evolve from this. So I think that this seismic campaign has actually not only yielded a good result in the legal example in the court of law, but also really mobilized Inuit to kind of, at a grassroots level, to really begin to take control and introduce new kinds of practices around research and monitoring that I see this as a very hopeful thing. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Noor, for that presentation. It was hard to get a sense of the scale of one of the maps you showed, but I take it that Nunavut is somewhat larger than Rhode Island. It's helpful for us, those of us who live here. It is my pleasure it is our pleasure this year to have as a long-term fellow John López, our final speaker for this afternoon's panel. John is an assistant professor in the Department of Art and Art History at UC Davis, and he specializes in the visual, material, and spatial intersections between early modern Europe and the New World. You can imagine that it was not a difficult decision to accept John's application for a long-term fellowship, especially during this year of water, since he is working on a book manuscript entitled The Aquatic Metropolis, which is a wonderful title and no doubt will become a phenomenal book. And it looks at the centuries-old efforts by the Aztec and the Spanish to combat catastrophic inundation in Mexico City. He connects this research to current climate change dialogue and debates, arguing that understanding a given city's historical arc of development relative to natural disasters in particular is necessary in order to gain a deeper perspective on how to address the environmental challenges that cities will increasingly face in the climate change era. And I think if this panel has any overarching theme, and this we can turn to in the panel discussion and indeed audience discussion that follows, it is what role the humanities have to play in these much more immediate and pressing challenges that are being faced by communities throughout the Americas and indeed throughout the world. John writes, how can the humanities help to better address the challenges that extreme weather poses to cities in the climate change era? We look forward to hearing his reflections on that and to the conversation that will follow. Please join me in welcoming John López.
Thanks, Neil. And just want to say that it's been a real pleasure to be here at the John Carter Brown at the Firing House, so much so that I never planned to leave. How do? Oh, yeah. How do? Is it the arrow? That one? Okay. Great. With global warming, rising sea levels, and extreme weather, cities around the world are at risk of catastrophic inundation. New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina, New York City with Superstorm Sandy, and most recently, Houston, Florida, and Puerto Rico are a handful of places besieged by extreme weather. Science and technology have been at the forefront at identifying the causes of climate change and modeling its effects, or inventing new technologies and products to dampen global warming. Yet, for a host of reasons, the humanities have lagged behind scientific and technical fields and disciplines with respect to climate change. Only recently has the environmental humanities become a disciplinary field in its own right. However, how can the humanities, aided by our diverse methods, analytical tools, and modes of inquiry and interpretation, participate in tackling this highly complex problem, the result and consequence of past human actions? What kind of insights to combat climate change can be gained from humanistic study? And how can we translate these insights into informed policy decisions? Today, I'd like to briefly speak about a new line of inquiry that stems from my current research on water in colonial Mexico City. That is, the relevance of historical environmental research and evidence for addressing the challenges that extreme weather poses to cities in the climate change era. With generous support of the JCB and the NEH, I'm currently preparing a book manuscript, The Aquatic Metropolis. It examines the centuries-old efforts by the Aztec and Spanish to combat catastrophic inundation at Mexico City via urban planning, water management, and environmental change. Underpinning this study is the visual culture of water, maps, drawings, and paintings of Mexico City's aquatic setting made by European and indigenous artists. Comparative examination of historical images reveals an epistemological shift on the part of the Spanish from their Aztec counterparts. From quick study of these images housed at the JCB, we glean that Mexico City has undergone a drastic urban transformation. While the 1524 Nuremberg map reveals that the Aztec built Tenochtitlan with water in mind, using causeways, floodgates, and dikes to mitigate environmental disaster, García Esconde's 1793 Plano General de la Ciudad de México reflects colonial efforts to end chronic flooding by banishing water via drainage, an approach predicated on draining the 6 lakes that once surrounded the island into the Gulf of Mexico by subjecting New World nature and the challenges it posed to rational analysis, thus overcoming the city's geography and transforming the island city into a mainland settlement. Historical images reveal an underlying objective of drainage: to dislodge, dislocate, and dehistoricize Mexico City from its historical path of development. In other words, saving the Spanish capital from catastrophic inundation was more than just an engineering endeavor to drain the lakes. To be more specific, drainage was about rupturing Mexico City from its pre-Hispanic form, freeing it from the hydrospatial practices embedded in Tenochtitlan's urban form and fabric by eliminating its most iconic feature, water. Thus, in scrutinizing the broader implications of a Spanish response to environmental crisis, a shift from Aztec causeways to Spanish drainage speaks to a new epistemological orientation to water that had transformative urban implications. Environmental historical research is important in contemporary Mexico City. It fosters broader understanding of Mexico City's current flood problem by providing historical perspective on how and why the city still floods. Although 4 of the 6 lakes that surrounded the city have been drained, and 2 are mere remnants of their former self, Mexico City continues to flood. Since 1950 alone, it has inundated no less than 80 times, and averaging a little more than a flood per year. To put this number in greater context, Tenochtitlan flooded every 64 years, while colonial Mexico City inundated every 14. If the lakes are no longer the cause of flooding, then what is causing the city to flood? And what is the cause of this drastic upsurge in the city's propensity to inundate? Recently, in 2014, the TEO, or Túnel Emisor Oriente, a drainage tunnel with the capacity to discharge 150 cubic meters of water per second, was completed. It was heralded as a technological marvel that would finally bring to an end Mexico City's age-old problem of flooding. What is striking about the TEO is that it's part and parcel of an early 17th century flood control model to end flooding via drainage. Since Enrico Martínez's 1607 desagüe, seen here in Descripción de la Comarca de México y Obra del Desagüe de la Laguna, Mexico City sought to overcome environmental crisis brought about by catastrophic inundation via a discharge tunnel. What this image inscribes and picture is a cultural attitude that the natural world and any problems posed by it must be understood and solved via scientific cartographic analysis and technological prowess. The premise of Martinez's plan rested on the belief that if the lakes were drained, flooding would end. However, the Dutch hydraulic engineer Adrian Bot argued in his 1615 flood control proposal for Mexico City that water was key to how the city functioned. Bot offered to rebuild the Aztec hydraulic network in addition to introduce windmills to regulate the lakes. Importantly, he also made the case that drainage would not end flooding, but instead increase its frequency, arguing that the city will subside if water was eliminated. As Bot already knew from centuries of low country hydraulic projects, drainage would set in motion subsidence, a process by which the land loses elevation, increasing flooding, which in turn necessitates more drainage. Subsidence is a never-ending cycle that 4 centuries of building drainage tunnels in Mexico City have proven Bot's argument correct. While no empirical data exists to determine how much Mexico City subsided in the viceregal period, key evidence suggests that since 1910 alone, the city has subsided no less than 10 meters, as seen here in Espacio Cerro's proposal for a pavilion in Mexico City's Parque Alameda that offers to bring greater public awareness of this water-related issue. Drainage has increased the risk of flooding in other ways. It had the unintended consequence of reclaiming land from the lakes. As new land became available, it was settled with people looking to the metropolis for economic opportunity and social mobility. Settling these low-lying former lake beds meant that there would be a greater risk of flooding than those living at higher elevations. However, this risk to inundate was compounded even more by Porfirian modernization efforts of the late 19th century. The Grand Canal, a symbol of Mexico City's modernity, was tasked with 2 duties: ending flooding and solving the city's sewage problem. It is a function that the THEO is also expected to perform. As recently as 2009, as seen here in these images, drainage tunnels fail because of unusual high rainfall, pushing them over their engineered capacities. Tunnels also fail because of subsidence, having the negative effect of inverting a tunnel's decline or rupturing it under geological strain. When tunnels fail, city residents are not just inundated with water, but with the human feces of millions and other biological and chemical contaminants produced by the largest metropolis in the Western Hemisphere. While Mexico City's upsurge in flooding is a result of human action, climate change promises to further increase the city's propensity to flood. If Mexico City averages a little more than a flood per year today, what will be its average in 50 or 100 years when climate change has made extreme weather the rule rather than the exception? Increased annual rainfall coupled with higher frequency of thunderstorms extended over a longer rainy season will only strain the THEO and the complex flood sewage network that it comprises, totaling over 7,400 miles. Technology alone will not solve Mexico City's current flood problem. 4 centuries of subsidence have shown that nature is not passive or static. Only time will tell if drainage will negate the increased risk of flooding that climate change promises. As urban planners, architects, ecological scientists, and environmental risk analysts and other kinds of practitioners work to prevent future inundations, there is a need to put Mexico City's past water management practices in greater historical context. Historical perspective offers wider awareness of the precarious conditions on which the city was founded and its path of urban development relative water and natural disaster. Generally speaking, environmental historical research and evidence is an underutilized resource to address the challenges that cities across the globe are facing and will continue to face in the climate change era. Undergirding this brief talk is the premise that how a city responds to environmental crisis can be a challenge posed to historical analysis and investigation, and that the insights to mitigate extreme weather in the present may derive from humanities scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for that presentation, which rounds out the formal presentations. What we've seen is really an incredible range of approaches and also geographical territories, from Canada to the Amazon, from Mississippi to Mexico. And what we're going to do now is perhaps the most challenging thing of all in this very august space. Believe me, we fight against it pretty much every day that we work in here, which is to have a conversation. And I'm going to invite the panelists to come up here as one living edge of the circle. But what we will try to do is to actually engage not only the panelists, but people who are here in the audience who have thoughts, ideas, professional expertise on some of these topics as well. So I'm not exactly sure how we'll do it, but we will do our best to do it. Please, if we could have the panelists come up initially, and we will be sharing microphones, and I believe I can probably repeat the question for the purposes of the audio recording from here as well. But we have anywhere between 20 to 25 minutes for a robust conversation, and water. Who would like to begin with questions or comments about the presentations that we have heard? Mike Jarvis.
Question inspired by Noor's talk to ask of Bathsheba. When, between 1848 and 1852, when the Yankee whaling fleet was in these northern waters, you sort of told two stories, the people at the water's edge and then these outsiders in their ships. Were there attempts at activism, intervention? Were there attempts to try to disrupt the whaling fleet, which would have easily been seen and would have been very disruptive and threatening to the Navy?
Is this on?
Yes.
Thank you. It's a good question. In the sort of early years of the Yankee fleet being in the Arctic, the relationship between people on shore, the Inuit and the Yupik, and then other peoples on the Russian side of the Bering Strait was mostly one of trade. It took a couple of decades for most people in the villages to realize what the impact was going to be of having the Yankee fleet there. And the piece that I sort of left out of my talk is what happens after 1858, when essentially the whaling ships figure out how to navigate in the sea ice better. And they return to the high Arctic and they kill off all but about 3,000 of the bowhead whales. And in the process of that happening, there is increasing distrust, but also reliance on the Yankee fleet on the part of indigenous peoples. And distrust because they understand that their livelihoods are being drained away, and dependence because their livelihoods have been drained away, and so they're actually increasingly reliant on calories that are imported from the south that they're trading for with walrus ivory and skins and things like that. So it's a complicated relationship that begins then, and actually is often invoked when in Inupiat people are talking now about oil companies. They're like, we've been through this before. We've had people come here for energy, and it was a mixed thing. Then it's probably going to be a mixed thing now.
I wanted to just ask the two presenters that talked about both the bowhead whales and the Inuit to comment upon what to me is just kind of an outsider. I see this kind of description of these far-flung locations in the globe that experienced long ago, some of them long ago, some currently, this conflict between whaling and indigenous peoples and modern culture, et cetera. But I was reminded about the voyages in the 1850s to harvest the bowheads, that the indigenous people in Rhode Island were whaling. In fact, for thousands of years whaling before Europeans came. And some of them right here in South County were on those ships that went up around South America, up to the Bering Straits. I have a colleague of mine whose great-great-grandfather was one of those sailors and was a Narragansett and was considered the best steerman in the fleet of Rhode Island whalers. And he went around, I think it was 1840s or so, up to out to Hawaii and then up later in the 50s up to Bering Strait. So it seems to me like, in a way, we're kind of intellectualizing and kind of conceptualizing this as a foreign event that is from other places, but really it's very local, very concrete, and very native knowledge about whaling came right from here, as well as, in the Arctic. So I'm just wondering if that is something you've looked into, and now that since we're living on the water's edge right here in Providence, if you'd like to comment on that.
Just to say, the question was broadly about the relationship of Inuit whaling and local native populations here in Rhode Island who participated in the whaling venture.
I don't know about that, but that sounds like a really interesting line of inquiry. But what I will say is that, and what I talk about in a longer version of this talk, or what I have talked about a little bit, is that the whalers were up north in the Canadian Arctic too. And that was certainly one of the early examples of extractive industry in that region. But the reception was different to that instance, and the whalers really relied on Inuit knowledge in a lot of their, especially once they began to overwinter. So they, at a certain point, they would keep their ships there throughout the winter season, and that's when they started to have a lot more interaction with Inuit that were living there, and introduced to their strategies for surviving and living through the winter. So I think your point about what I take from your point is that, first of all, that this is happening here, and that it might be fruitful to look at, to trace the role of Native peoples in different parts of the Americas in whaling, and that would be fascinating. I don't know if anyone's done that. But second of all, that there is this sort of different kinds of attitudes and exchanges, and sometimes, and I also should say that even around seismic testing, and even with Inuit in Alaska and Canada, there are different attitudes about seismic testing. In the Western Canadian Arctic, seismic testing has been going on for quite a long time, and people accept it more or less as something that's part of an industry that has pluses and minuses. So I'll let you answer the historical.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Nancy Shoemaker, who's a historian, has an entire book that's actually about the participation of East Coast indigenous peoples in the global whaling trade. And so she's, would be the authority that I would call on for this. And those indigenous whalers certainly do show up in my story. Some of them become fairly well known, particularly on the Russian side. There's one, I actually don't know his exact origin because it's kind of muddled up in the way the whaling logbooks just refer to people as an Indian that they signed on in New Bedford, so it's imprecise. But he became quite well known in the Western Arctic, so perhaps he is the ancestor of the person you knew. And I think that it is the kinds of knowledge that people are assembling on a whaling crew is really coming from all over. It includes indigenous people from here. It includes whalers who are hired in the Azores. It includes Hawaiians, indigenous Hawaiians who are picked up on the way north, and then eventually it will include people, Inupiat, Yupik, and Chukchi people who are hired by whaling ships once they get to the Arctic. And so there's kind of a melting assemblage happening in this whaling ship space of people from all over.
Amanda.
So yeah, I wanted to kind of continue this exploration that nothing is distant or foreign in what we've heard, and I was particularly fascinated by John's discussion of Mexico City, and I knew nothing at all about the history of that city and the way that it had been engineered, although as a climate scientist I know a lot about how it floods now. And one of the things I was reflecting on was the profoundly engineered nature of the Providence waterways and how we're reaping the whirlwind from our processes there. But I wanted to ask you a little bit more about Mexico City and in terms of the evolution of that engineering. Did it begin with the Spanish? Were they the ones that really started the drainage process?
Right. It began with the Spanish as early as 1555. Francisco Gudiel, who was a resident of the city, proposed drainage. But unlike Martinez, who proposed total drainage, Gudiel wanted to drain the excess water that would put the city in danger, and wanted to maintain a healthy supply of water because it's the way that the city functioned, both economically, socially, and also from an urbanistic standpoint, stayed up. Right. What's really interesting in connecting it to indigenous knowledge is that the Aztec constructed a city that was coupled with water. And water is at the inception of their foundation stories and of their social and political organization. So here, water was not just, was also a social and political mode of organization that was also then constructed in a built environment. What Martinez wanted to do is that he understood these kind of social benefits to water, but that the risk of flooding was so great that the water had to be basically discharged into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, to put this in greater kind of transatlantic history, Mexico City is the colonial capital of Spain. It is the arm that will basically administer the colonial project. And if you have a city of such importance flooded, for example, from 1629 to 34, it was flooded. And basically it created a havoc in terms of the political and social administration of the Spanish agenda in the New World.
Yes. Comment. In some ways, it sounds a lot like how Joel Carr has written about cities as having metabolism much more recently, and that the older way of maintaining metabolism and understanding it was attacked by the Spanish, and that they tried to keep the city alive, but they didn't really understand its own breathing or its own life.
Right. There is a metabolism. What I also want to point out is that Aztec hydraulic practices also had environmental consequences that reconditioned the lacustrine environment. And so this is not an instance of native peoples being one with the land, this kind of myth, right?
Yeah, Nancy.
This follows on what John just said. So just to drive what you said about the native peoples, I guess I'm struck that this panel, and thank you very much, this is very interesting, you're all very welcome. This panel is about the water's edge, but also about empire's edge. And in every case, we've got this encounter between the term I hate, but we'll use broadly, the West and native or indigenous people. And as Noor pointed out, a lot of these papers are about forms of caring for the environment. And we've made gestures that a purpose of doing humanities studies of the past and the environment, or one avenue into it, is looking at care and cultivating care for the environment. But these papers are all about the edge of empire, and in every case, the care comes from the side of the indigenous and colonized people. And I know, John, you just qualified that, and I want to acknowledge that. And I want to say, how should we think about it? How should we in the humanities think about that location of care, that's where we're observing it, that's where our lessons are coming from? Are those lessons that have been silenced that we need to reconnect with? Are those lessons particularly useful for us today, or is that the only location of the lessons? I guess, to what extent is this a criticism of Western contemporary capitalist culture that those examples of care aren't present here? So is it that we don't have those examples in this side of that imperial line, that we have to reach over for those examples of care? Or is it that these are historical, or these are better lessons, or submerged lessons? This is a broader question for everyone, but I'm just wondering, how many places can we be looking now from here? Because it's what we need to do.
And if I could also just, before you answer, Katherine, just say that it occurred to me that there's care in also different forms of intelligence, and intelligence might be considered something like urban metabolism. It might be considered part of indigenous technologies. It might be part of animal intelligence that we don't have access to. It occurs to me that from each of your different perspectives, anthropology, history, literature, art history, you're also grappling with different forms of intelligence and bringing out those different forms of intelligence to different degrees. Katherine?
So I just finished a book about compassion, and one of the last chapters takes up a vocabulary of care, actually in 17th century Montreal. And I just want to say, to come back to the Arctic, that one of the most powerful interlocutors for me in writing that is the anthropologist Lisa Stevenson's book, and she sets out a kind of examination of what she calls bureaucratic care about Canadian governmental responses to the TB epidemic. And I found that very interesting to think about the sort of troubling sites and identities of carers. So just a flag for that book, which I was thinking about as both of you spoke, but which is really a powerful and very complex way of thinking through these emotional questions.
That's a really wonderful question, Nancy. And the thing that I have noticed both in the 19th century in observing the ways in which whalers coming from the imperial edge in the capitalist case, and then in the 20th century when the Soviet Union basically replays the capitalist whaling story with a different set of ideological principles but a same set of ecological outcomes, is that there is something in the necessity for both capitalists and communists to produce a massive surplus that essentially drives out the luxury of care on the part of people who are on the front line of that extractive imperial project. And that it's not that the whalers aren't observing the whales that they're killing, exhibiting emotional states. They write about them in ways that do give a lot of affect and a lot of capacity for knowledge and care to the whales. And whalers write in their logbooks about kind of the pain that they feel when they kill a mother whale or they kill a baby whale in order to attract adults. They understand that there is an effective relationship there, and they simply do not have the luxury to act on it because the economic system under which they are operating, basically they don't have the agency to take that knowledge themselves and turn it into a set of actions that would sort of disassociate them from killing whales. And I don't know quite what to do with that, but I don't think it's as simple as Europeans not having the capacity for care. It's something about the inability to act on it because of the systems in which these people are themselves participant.
One of the things that I find quite interesting about Adrian Bort, who's this Dutch hydraulic engineer who was commissioned after an international search. He was located in France. He comes to the New World, and after a couple months of being in Mexico City, he comes to the New World to support drainage. And after being a couple months in the city, he says it's not going to work. And so what I really find interesting is that his proposal is based on Dutch hydraulic technology that looks identical to Aztec hydraulic technology, save for the machines, windmills and pumps. And so here you have a European who is understanding this kind, to borrow our colleague's term, this, the metabolism of the city, without having actually spent much time in the city. So I think you have here now European knowledge being mobilized, moving across the transatlantic to understand and also to apply to a new world problem.
I think this is a really interesting and provocative question as well. And I guess, I think if we look at the edge of empire or the edge of sort of the colonial reach, in some ways, this is still the edge of empire in northern Canada, and people understand it to be that. And so it's a very interesting and sort of productive place to look at those issues of ethics of care. But it's of course not the only place to look at those practices. I'm sure we could find many examples much closer to home. I do think that you know, what I didn't talk about in this talk, but I think I sort of mentioned is that this is these ways of caring look really different in different Inuit regions and different parts of Canada, and so Greenland is a good example of a place where the sort of discourse around colonialism has taken precedence over some of those discourses around ethics of care, and so they've really been putting in place an extractive agenda over the last decade or so, which is linked to their ability to govern, to practice home rule and to govern and become independent. And that's happening in other Inuit regions as well. So one conversation doesn't necessarily become dominant. And so then the question is, you know, what are the conditions under which Inuit are saying no to extractive development versus in other places where they might be more amenable. But I do think there's something about the fact that, for me, there's something in the Arctic about the fact that this is still self-consciously a conversation about colonialism and empire that makes it an interesting place to look at these questions.
Can I just come back briefly to the question of the edge of empire and this form of knowledge you were talking about? It strikes me, listening to you talk about Dutch imported knowledge, that there's some evidence within Europe that the sort of official knowledge about water engineering and water management is often drawing upon much more local knowledges. So Chandra Mukherjee's famous book about the construction of the Canal du Midi suggests that a lot of the knowledge for construction comes from washerwomen's understanding of how to build underwater, this kind of stuff. So we've got edges everywhere.
Other comments, questions?
Yeah, and maybe this will build on the edge of empire question. I was really struck by this parallel you drew, Katherine, between gouverner as navigation, gouverner as government and gouverner as navigation. And when I first heard it, I heard it as government in a political sense. But then shortly thereafter, you connected it with, maybe not directly, with the government of passion and the government of emotion, and being stuck in the early modern era when passion itself is such a liquid, often literally, phenomenon. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that and if that rings any bells for the other speakers as well.
Yeah, I have to say, coming from a book about emotion to a book about water, I've thought a lot about this. And when I've had to, you know, talk generally about the kind of work I'm doing, I always fall back on a line from Gabriel Sagar's Huron dictionary again, where he says, "Le lac est tout ému," the lake is very agitated. So ému being, of course, it's starting to be a vocabulary of emotion, but it's also a vocabulary of physical agitation. So I think there's certainly a great deal of crossover in those thinking about fluid bodies and the humoral body and all kinds of, you know, overlapping and palimpsestic ways of thinking about the passions in this period. It's certainly something I'm now interested in looking for emotional vocabularies in these texts and thinking about ways that emotional knowledge, for example, that Leclerc describes as being part of the rescue mission, play into a kind of a narrative about water. Other people have emotional waters.
Yes, Amanda, please. No, good.
It's interesting, I think, for me to think about this question that you brought up, Nancy, about where we're looking for the narrative of care, because it really, for me, brought to mind the very complex relationship that Noor alluded to, which is the relationship between Greenpeace and the Indigenous peoples of the Arctic and their different conceptions of care. And so I think, you know, that's a situation where on both sides the language is about caring for the environment, thinking for the environment, empathising with the non-human inhabitants, but in very, very different ways and coming from a very different place. And that's, I mean, it'd be interesting for you to comment a little bit more about that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it is really an interesting counter-example to what has been sort of a really antagonistic relationship for quite a long time. And I think, you know, on the other side of care is violence. So the Inuit experienced the campaign against seal hunting and harvesting that Greenpeace really led in the 1980s. And Greenpeace were, you know, really sharing these images of the clubbed baby seals on the ice, and their ethic of care was really about the violence done to the seal. But they in these campaigns lumped all forms of seal hunting together and really portrayed Inuit as a modern society that was getting away with hunting seals by drawing on or evoking their sort of tradition, but really did harm to and did violence to Inuit economies. And so in the area where I do my research in the Eastern Canadian Arctic, the price of a seal pelt was around $100 before the seal ban. And the Inuit would use that money to fund their hunting activities because they needed some form of money for that. And then after the seal ban was enacted, the price fell to about $10 a pelt. And so this is when the welfare state really kicked in in supporting household economies. So it was a really harmful episode for Inuit, and they, you know, when I was starting my work in Canada, and Lisa Stevenson was one of my committee members, and George Wenzel, who had done a lot of work for many years in this area, and he said, make sure that they know that you don't work for Greenpeace and that you're not working with any of the environmental organizations, because really, if that was a perception that you had, the people wouldn't talk to you. So what happened was interesting. Greenpeace, I think, there's been an increasing recognition on the part of conservation organizations that they got it wrong, and that you can't unilaterally exclude people from conservation. This is, of course, a much more complicated story, but in the case of Greenpeace, what they did was they issued an apology, and they published the apology in the regional newspaper, the Nunatsiaq News, and they said, we got it wrong, and we're really sorry. And you know, I think people took that on different levels, but some people really felt that it was a genuine apology. An apology was very important in the Christian tradition that a lot of Inuit are now part of. And so I think to return to the theme of care, I think they experienced that as an act of care on the part of Greenpeace, that they were attending to an emotional need to hear an apology. And so the mayor of Greenpeace, of the city, reached out to Greenpeace and said, we need someone to pay our legal fees. We need a lawyer. And Greenpeace said, great. You know, they were waiting for some kind of opening. So it was an aligning of sort of, the apology happened right before they really needed someone to help them with a lawyer. And then Greenpeace was pretty clever in the way that they worked with Clyde River, and there was never any Greenpeace promotion in any of the campaigns. So, you know, it was always about Clyde River. And when I talked to people in the North about it, you know, some people said, this is great, and we're glad, and we accept this apology. And many others were a little more circumspect and said, well, Greenpeace really harmed us. It's great that they're supporting us now, but I still don't trust them. So I think, you know, we'll see what emerges next. But it was an interesting example of the different forms of caring, taking sort of very radically different ideas of care, and how they came together in this one particular moment. And I don't know. We'll see what happens next.
One final comment from Noor.
Okay, I thank you. I mean, there are beautiful, beautiful papers, the four of you, so thank you. John, your title was around water and climate change, but you talked of inundation in Mexico City without giving for me, a sense of whether there had been great change as opposed to periodic and seasonal changes that occur with the water table. Although there was actually, I think, an image that I'd like to bring you to the present in terms of people's consideration of climate change, but to link that with the map, and I think it's Bathsheba's map and not yours, Noor, of the changing features of the Arctic as the ice melts, it is melts. And the way you've been talking, Noor, about care for the environment and linked it to the animals in the environment, and Bathsheba, you certainly talked about that too, but not around the environment and its changing edge. And you know that's such a stark, and it's a map that we know that it's familiar, but you know the time frame is dramatic. Like there's been half a loss of snow, of ice cover in 34 years. No, yes, 34 years is what you're covering. So I'm really asking people to sort of reflect on how people engage with the notion of climate change as something that is happening external to the everyday politics and economics of life in their own environments.
Well, I think architects in Mexico are probably leading or proposing some very interesting solutions or thinking about water. Some range from these kind of well, I should preface this, I was trained as an architect, so I'm very familiar in how to sell a romanticized image of something. And so some of these proposals are actually suggesting that they can reclaim a past Tenochtitlan. And it's virtually impossible to turn back the hands of time in this way. Others are thinking about how to recouple water and city together without constructing Tenochtitlan again. Right? So I think what we can glean from some of the proposals and some of this historical work is how do we take indigenous knowledge without reproducing that kind of urban form and fabric, but this idea of coupling city and water again to think about new ways of building, but also engaging water.
I think the sort of short answer to generalize hugely about a region that's, where there are many individual communities with many individuals in them with lots of thoughts about what's happening in the contemporary moment, would be that the water's edge is receding from the place that people are able to access it easily because the sea ice is retreating. And depending on which communities you're in and what animals you're used to harvesting on that sea ice edge, this has varying degrees of quite profound impact on people's abilities to participate in subsistence economies and traditional practices of various sorts. And this particular winter, if anybody is sort of a follower of the sea ice, has been particularly striking and rather terrifying because there was open water north of the Diomede Islands in the Bering Strait in February, which just sort of, it shouldn't be, right? It doesn't make any sense. And the people that I know on St. Lawrence Island, which is south of the Bering Strait by a couple hundred miles, in the last couple of years have had to go, take boat trips, 200 miles north through the Bering Strait to find the ice edge so that they can hunt walrus. And so what the subsistence shape and the kind of community fabric looks like in a community where the water's edge has gone far away in terms of the ice is a thing that people are thinking about all the time.
Yeah, I think there's a book title that I often refer to when I try to reflect on what climate change means for Inuit, because there's a book called The Earth is Faster Now, and it's about Inuit observations of environmental change. But I think really for the people that I speak with who are living in northern communities, they experience environmental change as a quickening that's linked to other kinds of quickening. So I think that's why it's hard to disentangle the ice melting from the more ships coming into the region, from different kinds of exploration happening. And these are all really part of change for these communities. And so climate change is its own urgency. And most people that I speak to talk about that, but it's also embedded in a whole host of other changes that are bringing related urgencies. So it's a bit of a muddle, I guess I would say.
Okay, we want to leave time for people to have casual conversations, as well as to take a look at some of the works that Katherine has selected for us that are part of this collection, which go from Inuit territory all the way down to Antarctica. I did want to mention two things. One, that this opening panel is part of a much larger and far more extensive series of activities happening over the course of the next 2 weeks here at Brown, with the participation of the David Winton Bell Gallery, the Brown Arts Initiative, the Kogut Institute for the Humanities, the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society, and the John Carter Brown Library for topics related to the environmental humanities in particular. I turn your attention to 2 days of activities at the Kogut Institute on Friday and Saturday, which will include, among other things, someone who has also written a book on the hydrographic or hydrological nature of Mexico City, Vera Candiani, as well as a keynote lecture by Amitav Ghosh at 4 p.m. on Friday. And there are other activities happening in and around the campus community, far too many for any sane person to attend all of them, but do your best. And the final note is to say that we currently have on exhibition a collection of works that relate to one of the phenomena brought about by the maritime world, and that is on the enslaved dwellings. The dwellings of the enslaved and the free in the Americas, a spectacular exhibition that begins with Elmina on the coast of Africa and ends in the 19th century in some of the countries that we're still grappling with the effects of slavery. This was curated by Bertie Mandelblad, our curator of maps and prints, recently arrived here at the library. And even though we had originally intended to have this go down and have our next exhibition go up, it was such a wonderful exhibition that we decided to extend it. I heartily encourage you to take a look at it, and indeed to think about the connections that exist between the land and the sea, and the nature of knowledge of people who are both enslaved and free, grappling with the different kinds of environmental circumstances that they find themselves in. Once again, thank you to Noor, thank you to Amanda, thanks to all of you for having come, and a special thanks to our panelists for joining us, and please join us for a reception following this panel.